Hi everyone, this is Judy, your EJ Strong intern, and today I'll be showing you how to fill out the vulnerability assessment form. The purpose of the vulnerability assessment form is to assess the human and non-human elements of a community that may be susceptible to a certain hazard. Remember, we are defining vulnerability as the proximity of human and non-human elements to risk. So for example, a certain home's distance from the coast during a hurricane. We will be assessing capacities during the next webinar. You can find the blank vulnerability assessment form on page 4 of your webinar manual if you would like to follow along. Now let's get into what exactly is on the vulnerability assessment form. We have a few columns starting with hazard profile, then elements at risk, which can be further divided into human elements and non-human elements. We'll talk more about what these elements are in a bit. The next section on the form is location of the elements at risk specific to the hazard, which can be broken down by level of vulnerability if your hazard has a spatial component, such as distance to coast during a hurricane. And then at the bottom of the form is a section for a summary of the vulnerability assessment, which will synthesize the information we put into the rest of the form. So we'll start with the hazard profile. This will be similar to the hazard descriptions we wrote for our hazard assessment and can contain as much detail as you deem necessary to start assessing vulnerability. I will be running us through this form using an urban fire event or conflagration originating at the shipyard in North Charleston near many of our Lamb-State communities as an example. When you fill this form out, you should choose one specific hazard to focus on like this. So with our example in mind, our hazard profile reads, a conflagration at the Det Jens shipyard at 1670 Dry Dock Ave in North Charleston is the hazard of choice here. This type of fire is not something that occurs very often in the city. However, with the amount of industry that is highly proximate to the Lamb-State communities, the potential for a widespread fire persists. It has the potential for affecting the whole community, including the need to evacuate and worsening air quality issues. It could cause widespread destruction to all property, including homes, businesses, and infrastructure. So next, we'll start to identify elements that could be at risk from a fire, getting more specific than just human and non-human. So starting with human elements, we'll want to identify populations that are inherently more susceptible to hazards than others, which can be those over 65 years old, children around 5 years old or younger, people with lower levels of education, linguistically isolated populations, people of color, and people of lower income. Moving on to non-human elements, we will want to think about components of the built environment that may be vulnerable specifically to a fire, or if impacted by a fire, could have negative impacts on people's abilities to cope and recover. So these could include things like houses, schools, hospitals and clinics, Superfund and hazardous waste sites, utilities like water, electricity, and wastewater, and essential businesses like grocery stores, hardware stores, gas stations, and pharmacies. Please note that this list is not exhaustive, and your perspective on elements at risk can include other things that we may not have covered here. So next, we'll start filling out the main part of the form, which is counts of the elements at risk by distance of the elements to the source of the hazard, which in our case is the shipyard. Please note that this distance breakdown may not apply for all hazards. So for example, COVID-19 and pandemics, you may want to ignore this distance breakdown altogether and just keep overall counts of each element. For a fire, however, there are specific locations and environments where fires are more likely to start, so we can keep these distance breakdowns for our example. Now, this part will require a little more effort and research, so we put together a list of online links and other resources that will help you hunt down the exact numbers to paint a full picture of vulnerability in your community. I will be touching on these resources as I go through this example, but for your reference, they are on pages 6 and 7 of your webinar manual. and all are free to use. So to start with our human elements, a lot of this information can be found on EJ Screen, which is an EPA tool that contains demographic and environmental data. So I'll demo quickly here how to use EJ Screen. So if you follow this URL here, you will see the EPA's EJ Screen mapping tool. So zoom into Charleston, North Charleston, if it isn't already. You can just type in Charleston on the search bar up here and it'll bring you right to Charleston. And then take a look at the toolbar at the top. So the first button on the left will allow us to select areas for analysis. So let's click that and then click Select Location. This opens up a box that gives you different options on how to select your area. But the quick and easy way to get started here is click on Map to select a census block group. So this option here. Then all you do is click on the map on an area that you want data for. So I'll click around here near our Lamsey communities. And then you click on Explore Reports for that area that you selected. Close this out. Now there's a lot of great information that pops up in the box here, and it's specific to a pretty high resolution area and presented all in nice graphics. So this is a great source for environmental justice data for a pretty small area. But for our form, we want raw data, not the graphics. So we're going to click on this little button on the demographic indicators tab on the bottom right that says Get Data Table. So click on that, X this box out, and you'll see a new table that popped up. You may have to resize it to see all the numbers. But this new table gives you the percent of the total population of the block group you selected that falls into a certain variable. So there's all kinds of information. What we want is all the way at the bottom under demographic variables. So for example, what this table tells you is that in this block group, which is numbered here, which has a population of 882, 91% of that block group can be identified as people of color. So at this point, you can get easily overwhelmed by the numbers. So it's important to stay as organized as possible. I recommend taking note of the block group you selected, its total population, and that percent value of each variable that you're interested in a spreadsheet or even just with pen and paper. And the last step here, after you get all the percents that you're interested in, is X this out. And we want to get the distance of the block group to the hazard so we can identify how much of those numbers are within certain vulnerability levels. So we'll click this measure tool on our toolbox at the top. Select the middle button on the measure tool. This allows us to draw a line between two objects. And then click around the approximate center of the block group. It may not be perfect, but just try to get the center of the block group and click. And then just trace a line to the hazard source, which is our shipyard in this case. So we'll double click when we think we're there, just to stop that line. And this tells us that the block group and all the data we were just looking at, we can see that data as being 0.9 miles away from our hazard. So I would take note of, in addition to the demographic variables, the total population and the block group number, take note of this distance. So if your community extends beyond one block group, which it probably does, you'll want to repeat this process for all adjacent block groups that make up the entirety of the area you are assessing. So writing down each block group's demographics, populations, and distances separately. So we'll go back to our slides. So here I wrote everything down in a spreadsheet. So that block group number here, each group's distance to the shipyard, and then what that distance means in terms of vulnerability. So for our fire example, we're viewing low vulnerability as anything over a mile away. Anything between a half mile and a mile is a medium vulnerability block group. And anything under a half a mile, we are viewing as high vulnerability. And then for each of those block groups, we have our total population and then those percents. And this is just converted to a decimal. So the percent divided by 100. And for our form, we don't want percents, we want exact numbers. So all you have to do is multiply that decimal value by the total population for each block group, and that will give you the exact number that falls into each demographic category. And this equation is down at the bottom here. So all you have to do once you have those numbers is sum up the counts for all block groups by the vulnerability level. So you're going to sum up, for example, the number of elderly people that fall into medium vulnerability block groups and plug those into the form just like this. So next, we'll start identifying our non-human elements. Once you've gone through all of the human elements, we'll move on to non-human. So this information can come from a variety of sources, and I would recommend always ground truthing what you find on the internet by talking with other community members or city officials. And you can also use PLA tools like storytelling and mapping to verify what you may find on the internet, just to make sure it's accurate. So starting with housing units here, the first thing on our list, the best way to find this information is to take each block group of interest that you identified in the last section. These are those codes that we found in EJ Screen. So just break down this block group and do a quick and dirty Google search for American Community Survey. Let's say block group 1, census tract 55, Charleston County, South Carolina. And you'll find a website. The first thing that pops up will have a great summary of census data in a more accessible way than trying to scroll through all that data yourself. So in this website, you'll scroll down to the housing category. And under housing, the very first thing is total housing units. So for this block group that we selected, there are 366 housing units. So all you want to do is pull that number out, remember what this block group's distance to the hazard is, and assign those housing units accordingly into the form. So next for schools, the next thing on our non-human elements list, luckily in this case, the city of North Charleston had a list of schools available on their website. So your area of interest or your city might have this. If it doesn't, Google Maps is a great source for information for schools. So you just do a quick Google search for schools, identify a list of schools in your area, and take note of their addresses. And then after you do this, you can use Google Earth to find the exact distance between the school and the hazard source, or the shipyard in this case. So if you go to Google Earth, this is the Google Earth page here. You'll use the search tool, this little magnifying glass, to search for the address of your school. And then once you have located each school, click on this ruler tool to draw a line between the school and the shipyard. And once you do that, the distance between the two will pop up here, and just make sure you're looking at miles as your unit. So again, it's really useful to keep all this information written down or in a spreadsheet so you don't get lost. So once you have your list of schools, each school's address, you'll put down the distance that that school is from the hazard, and then associate that distance with its level of vulnerability. The process for the rest of the non-human elements is very similar. So I searched Google Maps, just like I did with schools. I searched for hospitals and clinics, utilities like water, electricity, and wastewater, and essential businesses such as grocery stores, gas stations, pharmacies, and hardware stores. And just like with the schools, went to Google Earth to measure each item's distance to the shipyard. So the next thing on our list is Superfund sites and hazardous waste sites. These are a little trickier to find because they generally aren't listed on Google Maps or city websites. So I would use the EPA's Toxic Release Inventory website. And this is a great source to find information on industrial facilities that have experienced spills and releases. So these would be facilities that could be at a high risk of contaminating people. So on their main page, if you follow this URL at the top and scroll all the way to the bottom to this TRI search function, just type in your area of interest. I just did North Charleston, and this will pop up a map just like the one on the right here. So once you have this map, each point on the map will represent a different facility or a Superfund site that they have data for. So if you just hover your mouse over each of these points when you're in the TRI, it'll tell you the name of that site, its address, the type of industry it is, and a lot of other great information. But once you have the address, again, you can put that right into Google Earth like we did before to find its distance from the hazard. So you'll just count these all up and put these on the form as well. And these are our Superfund site and hazardous waste site totals for the North Charleston area. So once you have identified all non-human elements and their distances to the hazard, if that applies, simply count up each element by its distance and add that count to the form. So we have our human elements at the top here, and we just identified all of our non-human element counts. So this can definitely be time consuming, but think about it like you are making a great inventory of community assets and concerns that can be used in a lot of different ways outside of this form. So once you've counted up all your elements, we can finish up our form by providing a written summary of our findings. Just like the synthesis from the hazard assessment, this is a great way to give meaning to these numbers and practice translating research into communicable findings that we can pass on to others. So for our form here, we came up with the total population at high vulnerability to a conflagration at the Det Jens shipyard is 982 people, or 15% of the LAMC population. Those at medium and low vulnerability of a half mile or more away from the fire's source totals 5,761 people. Non-human elements at high vulnerability includes 324 housing units, or 10% of homes in the LAMC communities, 1 hospital/clinic, 2 hazardous waste sites, 1 water supply center, and 2 essential businesses. Over 16% of essential businesses are within a half mile to a mile or at medium vulnerability to the conflagration. Finally, 2 out of the 12 schools, or 17% of schools in the LAMC area, reside within the medium vulnerability range. And that is everything you need to know to complete a vulnerability assessment for your community. Like the hazard assessment form, I would recommend filling out one of these forms per hazard your community is facing. Though once you identify all your elements of risk the first time, it should be much quicker and easier to repeat for other hazards. So keep those lists handy. Looking ahead, you may also want to consider redoing this form every year or so. As population figures can change, businesses can close and open, and you want to make sure you're always looking at up-to-date information. And as always, please reach out with any questions, and thank you for tuning in.